In the chronicles of English monarchy, few deaths remain as chilling, controversial, and symbolically charged as that of Edward II. What transpired within the stone walls of Berkeley Castle in September 1327 has echoed for centuries, woven into layers of rumour, propaganda, and dread. Officially, his passing was attributed to natural causes, yet almost immediately, darker whispers took root. They suggested not just a killing, but a murder so grotesque and laden with meaning that it was intended to erase the dignity of a king and to terrify all who might resist those in power. Edward Plantagenet had been born into one of Europe's greatest dynasties, the heir to the formidable Edward I, Longshanks, the conqueror of Wales and scourge of Scotland. Yet the son who inherited his throne would die a captive, abandoned by his barons, despised by his people, and betrayed by his own wife. His reign, scarred by military debacles and personal scandals, ended in a fall so absolute that even the manner of his death became a weapon, moulded to tarnish his legacy for generations. The narrative of Edward II's final days forces us to confront more than a medieval mystery. It reveals a society's obsession with authority, masculinity, and punishment. It demonstrates how personal relationships could unravel kingdoms, and how vengeance, cloaked in the language of justice, could descend into calculated cruelty. To grasp what happened in that castle cell, we must understand the man himself, his nature, his failings, and the enemies he created through his choices. Edward was born in 1284, the fourth son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. Fate, however, promoted him to heir after the early deaths of his elder brothers. His father, Longshanks, embodied the medieval ideal of kingship, a warrior who subdued Wales, pushed Scotland to the brink of collapse, and projected English power across Europe. The young Edward grew up in the looming shadow of this legend. The expectation was simple: he would match, or even surpass, his father's achievements. But Edward's nature ran contrary to such ideals. Whereas his father had thrived in the brutal life of campaigning, the son preferred music, leisurely pursuits, and most dangerously, intimate attachments to companions who scandalized the court. In a society where kings were expected to be stern leaders, devout Christians, loyal husbands and fathers who secured the succession, Edward's temperament appeared not merely unorthodox but perilous. When he ascended the throne in 1307, the contrast with his father became glaring. Edward I had commanded loyalty through fear and triumph. Edward II sought solace in companionship. Chief among these companions was Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of modest birth, who captured the king's affection to such a degree that he was showered with lands, titles, and honours normally reserved for England's greatest magnates. Gaveston's rise destabilised the fragile equilibrium of English politics. The nobility expected consultation, respect, and the distribution of patronage in line with their ancient privileges. Instead, they saw a foreign favourite monopolising influence, even receiving the earldom of Cornwall, one of the crown's most prestigious honours. Chroniclers of the age, often hostile to Edward, described the intimacy between the king and Gaveston in terms laced with suspicion. Whether theirs was a romantic relationship or a friendship of unusual intensity, it offended medieval expectations of royal behaviour. A king's marriage was supposed to be a political alliance, his affections subordinate to duty. Edward's devotion to Gaveston, and his public disregard for the nobility's outrage, signalled weakness and recklessness. When military failures compounded this scandal, discontent hardened into fury. Edward inherited war with Scotland, where Robert the Bruce sought to secure independence. Instead of glory, Edward delivered humiliation. At Bannockburn in 1314, a vastly outnumbered Scottish force shattered the English army in one of the most humiliating defeats in English history. For a medieval king, such a collapse was more than military, it was spiritual and symbolic. A monarch who could not lead his men in triumph forfeited the aura of divinely sanctioned authority. The nobility's patience broke. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, Edward's own cousin, magnates sought to strip the king of real power. They imposed ordinances curtailing his authority and demanded control over appointments and finances. The struggle was not only political, it was existential. Could Edward be considered fit to reign at all? In 1308, Edward had married Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, in what should have been a stabilizing alliance. Beautiful, shrewd, and strong-willed, Isabella seemed the ideal queen for a troubled monarch. She bore him 4 children, including the future Edward III, fulfilling her dynastic role. Yet her dignity and influence were gradually corroded by her husband's relentless devotion to his favourites. After Gaveston's execution by rebel nobles in 1312, Edward transferred his affections to Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. The Despensers amassed extraordinary wealth and authority, ruling England in practice while Edward retreated into dependency. Their rapaciousness earned them universal hatred. For Isabella, the insult was personal as well as political. Her husband's disregard humiliated her before the French court and undermined her authority in England. By the 1320s, the Queen's patience had disintegrated. Sent on a diplomatic mission to France, Isabella refused to return. Instead, she entered into a partnership, both romantic and political, with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had once languished in the Tower of London before escaping into exile. Their union combined her royal legitimacy with his martial ambition. Together, Isabella and Mortimer orchestrated one of the most daring coups in English history. In 1326, they landed in England with a small force. Yet the kingdom, rotting with discontent against Edward and the Despensers, collapsed before them. Nobles defected en masse. Even common townsmen turned against the king. The Despensers were captured and executed with ferocity, their gruesome fates a reflection of the hatred they had inspired. Edward, meanwhile, fled desperately westward, seeking refuge in Wales. By November, he was caught near the border. The man who had once worn Europe's most glittering crown was now a prisoner, utterly abandoned. His capture signaled not only the ruin of a reign, but also the beginning of a systematic effort to annihilate his dignity, his legacy, and perhaps his life itself. The seizure of Edward II in late 1326 marked not just the fall of a monarch, but the dawn of an unprecedented constitutional experiment. For the first time in English history, a king was to be formally stripped of his crown while still alive. The problem confronting Isabella and Roger Mortimer was stark: how to cloak their revolution in the garments of legality. To depose an anointed sovereign required not only brute force, but also a justification that could convince church nobility and commons that they acted in the name of the kingdom rather than personal ambition. Parliament was summoned in January 1327. The gathering, however, was no open forum of free debate. London seethed with Mortimer's supporters, and Edward himself languished in captivity, unable to plead his cause. The nobles and clergy who assembled were presented with a carefully prepared indictment. The king had been incompetent, had squandered the realm's defences, had surrendered authority to corrupt favourites, and had brought dishonour to the crown. The charges, while not unfounded, were deployed less as a search for truth than as a weapon to provide legitimacy for a coup already decided. What made this deposition so significant was the way it was framed. Isabella and Mortimer insisted that they acted not merely as rebels, but as representatives of the community of the realm. This meant that Edward's removal was justified not only by baronial discontent, but by a claim to the collective will of England itself. It was a radical step in the slow evolution of parliamentary authority. Kingship was no longer untouchable if a ruler failed his duties. Edward was held at Kenilworth Castle while these proceedings unfolded. Chroniclers record the pitiful scene when emissaries presented him with Parliament's demand that he formally abdicate in favour of his young son Edward of Windsor, the future Edward III. Dressed no longer as a sovereign, but in plain black garments, the former king wept openly. He asked that his son be treated with loyalty, and that his captors show mercy. Whether he consented freely or under the threat of force remains contested, but the result was inevitable. A written act of renunciation was secured, and England entered uncharted waters. It now had a living ex-king, but what was to be done with him? Leaving him free was unthinkable. He remained by divine anointing, the rightful king in the eyes of many. Keeping him confined indefinitely was costly and dangerous. So long as he lived, he was a potential rallying point for any discontented faction, foreign or domestic. The new regime faced the same problem that has plagued countless usurpers throughout history. The deposed monarch was too dangerous to ignore. The solution was relocation. Edward was transferred from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a site chosen with chilling deliberation. The castle belonged to Thomas de Berkeley, a baron whose family had suffered under Edward's rule and could be trusted to guard him with little sympathy. Its location was remote enough to prevent rescue, its walls strong enough to prevent escape, and its lord personally invested in ensuring the captive's misery. At Berkeley, Edward was stripped not only of crown and liberty, but of dignity itself. His chamber, according to some accounts, was deliberately situated above the castle's sewer, filling the air with foul vapours intended to weaken his health. His diet was meagre and irregular, his bedding coarse and inadequate, his treatment humiliating at every turn. It was psychological warfare as much as imprisonment, a systematic campaign to remind him daily of his fall from majesty to degradation. Chroniclers suggest that this cruelty was not random. It was calculated to sap his will, to make his death, whether by illness, despair, or violence, seem the natural consequence of captivity rather than the act of deliberate murder. If Edward were to die from exposure, infection, or neglect, Isabella and Mortimer could maintain the fiction that they had merely confined him securely. But the slow erosion of his health was not enough. By the summer of 1327, political pressure mounted, rumours circulated of plots to rescue Edward and restore him to power. Foreign courts, especially in France and the papacy, began to ask uncomfortable questions about his treatment. Pope John VI in Avignon even expressed concern for the welfare of the anointed monarch. Meanwhile, within England, a whispering unease spread. Had the nobles gone too far in deposing God's chosen ruler? Isabella and Mortimer understood the danger. So long as Edward lived, he embodied a threat that could not be extinguished by legal fictions or parliamentary decrees. Their own authority, exercised in the name of the boy King Edward III, rested on fragile foundations. If Edward II escaped, or was restored by sympathetic lords, their power would collapse instantly. Thus the brutal logic became clear: Edward II must die. Yet his death had to be staged in such a way as to avoid martyrdom. A straightforward execution, beheading, hanging, or poisoning, would brand them tyrants and risk rebellion. The method had to leave no obvious marks, allow for official deniability, and serve as a grim warning to others. Medieval political killings often balanced practical elimination with symbolic messaging. Punishments were designed to mirror crimes, embodying medieval notions of divine justice. In Edward's case, rumours of his intimate relationships with Gaveston and the Despensers had scandalized contemporaries, casting doubt on his masculinity and his suitability as king. To many, his sins were not merely political but sexual, and so, according to the most infamous accounts, his killers devised a method both concealing and proclaiming his fate: the insertion of a red-hot iron rod into his body through the rectum, burning his organs from within, leaving no outward wounds but inflicting unimaginable torment. It was, if true, not only a murder, but a theatrical act of symbolic justice, designed to annihilate both the man and the reputation. Whether this account is fact or propaganda remains disputed. Some chronicles simply report a natural death, others hint at foul play without detail. Yet the persistence of the story, and its resonance with medieval attitudes about sexuality and punishment, suggests that even if embellished, it captured the psychological truth of how Edward's enemies wanted him to be remembered, not as a warrior or king, but as an object of ridicule, shame, and pain. The events that unfolded within the walls of Berkeley Castle in September 1327 remain among the most debated episodes in medieval history. Chroniclers writing in the years that followed offered differing accounts, some vague, some disturbingly specific. A few insisted that Edward II succumbed naturally, worn down by grief, poor treatment, and the filth of his surroundings. Others whispered of foul play, though without details. Yet the most lurid and persistent version describes a killing so cruel, so symbolically crafted, that it has haunted England's historical memory ever since. According to this account, Edward was held down by guards as his executioners carried out their work. A hollow metal horn was placed into his rectum, through which a red-hot iron rod was inserted. The searing metal burned his internal organs, killing him in agony while leaving no visible external wounds. If true, this method was not chosen out of sadism alone, but for its symbolism. His enemies had long mocked his intense attachments to male favorites. His alleged sexual sins had been used to discredit his kingship. By killing him in this manner, the conspirators sought to brand him forever with humiliation, turning his death into a grotesque commentary on his life. Such an act would not have been improvised. It required planning, equipment, complicity. The iron had to be heated in secret, the victim restrained, the deed performed with precision to avoid leaving telltale marks. This was not a sudden crime of passion, but a calculated performance of political violence, intended both to silence Edward and to proclaim his disgrace. On September 21, 1327, the death of the former king was reported with suspicious swiftness to London. The official line was that he had died of natural causes, illness, melancholy, and the hardships of captivity. Couriers spread the news rapidly across England, reaching sheriffs, bishops, and noble households in coordinated fashion. The speed of this communication suggested preparation, as though the announcement had been readied in advance, awaiting only confirmation of the deed. At Berkeley itself, the scene was tightly controlled. Thomas de Berkeley, lord of the castle, claimed afterwards that he had been absent during the crucial hours, as if to distance himself from responsibility. His convenient absence, almost certainly prearranged, gave him plausible deniability, while allowing others to oversee the execution. Servants, guards and attendants who had been present soon vanished from the record, some dismissed, others dying suddenly, a few disappearing altogether. The elimination of witnesses formed the final stage of the conspiracy. The treatment of Edward's corpse formed another layer of deception. Medieval embalming was crude, involving evisceration, spices, and sealing with wax. But it had one effect useful to his killers. It obliterated internal evidence. If his organs had indeed been destroyed by heated metal, the embalming process would erase most traces before the body could be examined. By the time the public saw him, only an unmarked shell remained. Edward's remains were displayed with ceremony before burial. Crowds were invited to view the body, reassured by the lack of wounds. Chroniclers note that nothing obvious betrayed violence, lending credibility to the government's narrative. Yet the very absence of marks fed suspicion. Whispers spread that this was precisely the point, that he had been murdered in a way designed to leave no trace upon the skin. From Berkeley the body was taken with solemn pomp to Gloucester, where Edward was interred in the cathedral. The funeral was orchestrated as political theatre. Isabella and Mortimer ensured that all appeared dignified, pious and respectful. They wept publicly, played the role of grieving relatives, and emphasized their commitment to the dignity of kingship. The tomb erected for Edward, which still survives, proclaimed him a rightful monarch who had died a natural death. But behind the pageantry lay calculation. By giving him an honourable burial, they sought to pacify public unease, to prevent martyrdom, to quiet suspicions. The spectacle of a proper royal funeral masked the reality that this was no ordinary passing, but a killing intended to secure their rule. Even as the funeral unfolded, the conspiracy's final loose ends were being tied. Several of those who had attended Edward at Berkeley met mysterious ends within months. Guards died in accidents, servants disappeared without explanation, and minor officials connected to the imprisonment were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Whether these deaths were orchestrated or simply convenient is impossible to prove, but the pattern suggests a deliberate effort to ensure that no one could challenge the official version of events. The cover-up was remarkably effective. Official documents recorded only a natural death. Chronicles close to Isabella and Mortimer remained discreet. Yet the rumours refused to die. In taverns, monasteries and noble halls, the tale of the red-hot poker circulated with morbid fascination. The more it was denied, the more people believed it. In the short term, Isabella and Mortimer achieved their goal. Edward II was gone, and with him the most immediate threat to their authority. The boy king Edward III was crowned, and real power flowed through his mother and her lover. For several years they ruled in triumph, presenting themselves as saviours who had rescued the realm from an incompetent monarch. Yet, the method of Edward's removal carried a poison that would eventually undo them. The grotesque rumours surrounding his death corroded the moral foundation of their authority. Even those who had hated Edward II began to wonder if his killers had crossed a line too terrible to ignore. The story of Berkeley Castle spread not as reassurance but as horror, eroding trust in the very rulers who had sought to cleanse the realm. Beyond England's shores, foreign courts reacted cautiously. Officially, most accepted the claim of natural death. Few wished to provoke diplomatic tensions by challenging the story. Yet in private correspondence, suspicion ran rife. French envoys whispered of murder, papal officials hinted at outrage, and the Holy Roman Empire expressed unease. Edward's violent end, whether fact or rumour, cast a shadow over England's reputation abroad. The ultimate irony was that the young Edward III, whose throne had been secured by his father's deposition and death, would one day turn on Isabella and Mortimer, with the decisiveness his father had lacked. In 1330, only 3 years after Berkeley, the boy king engineered Mortimer's arrest and execution, while consigning his mother to a life of secluded retirement. Among the charges laid against Mortimer was the murder of Edward II. Even the son who owed his crown to the coup recognized the blood guilt that stained his mother's lover. The fate of Edward II did not end with his funeral at Gloucester. In many ways, his death was only the beginning of a legend that would shape English political culture for centuries. The manner of his end, whether natural, conventional, or horrifically symbolic, became a mirror in which each generation projected its own anxieties about power, morality, and authority. For Isabella and Mortimer, the brutal efficiency of his removal achieved its immediate purpose. No rebellion coalesced around the fallen king. Yet the very cruelty of his supposed murder, whispered across England, seeded the eventual downfall of the new regime. People who had once supported Edward's deposition began to question whether they had sanctioned an act of unforgivable savagery. The political order appeared stable, but its moral foundations were crumbling. Rumors about what had truly happened in Edward's cell never ceased. Chroniclers close to the regime wrote cautiously of natural decline, while hostile voices relished lurid tales of torture. The story of the red-hot poker was particularly irresistible. Its symbolic neatness, punishing a king accused of effeminacy and favoritism through a death targeting his supposed vices, made it memorable and believable in a medieval world where justice was expected to reflect sin. Modern historians have wrestled with these accounts. Some argue that the tale was a later invention, a propaganda weapon used after Isabella and Mortimer themselves fell from power in 1330. According to this view, Edward may have died of neglect, or even by simpler murder, with the grotesque details embroidered by enemies eager to blacken their reputations. Others, however, point to circumstantial evidence that supports foul play, the suspicious speed of the death announcement, the elimination of witnesses, the embalming that destroyed internal evidence, and the political necessity of removing him. Even if the most gruesome detail was exaggerated, the underlying reality was clear. Edward had not simply faded away, he died because powerful people decided that he could not be allowed to live. Perhaps the greatest irony of Edward II's death was the impact it had on his son. When Edward III came of age, he revealed none of his father's indecision. In 1330, he seized control with ruthless efficiency, executing Mortimer and confining Isabella. Among the accusations leveled at Mortimer was complicity in Edward II's murder, a charge the young king used to justify his coup. Edward III's reign, marked by military victories in Scotland and France, seemed in many ways a deliberate repudiation of his father's failures. Where Edward II had been mocked for weakness, Edward III cultivated the image of the warrior king, restoring English prestige through triumph at battles like Crecy and Poitiers. The shadow of his father's fate taught him the price of appearing indecisive, effeminate, or overly dependent on favourites. To rule, he understood, was to embody strength visibly and without compromise. The deposition of Edward II had another legacy beyond family drama. It introduced a radical precedent into English governance. The idea that a king could be removed, not only by God's will in death, but by political action if he failed in his duties. Parliament's claim to act on behalf of the community of the realm planted a seed that would grow across the centuries. In later crises, the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War, even the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the precedent of Edward II's removal resurfaced. His fate demonstrated that monarchy was not an absolute shield. Legitimacy depended upon performance. Kings who neglected their duties, alienated their nobles, or violated social expectations risked not only deposition but destruction. Isabella herself paid dearly for her role. Though she initially reigned as the triumphant she-wolf of France, wielding power through her son's minority, her authority crumbled as Edward III matured. Her partner Mortimer was executed in 1330, accused of tyranny and of Edward II's murder. Isabella was spared death, likely out of filial respect, but was confined to a quiet retirement. The queen who had overthrown her husband ended her days far from the centre of politics, remembered less as a stateswoman than as a symbol of betrayal. Her involvement in Edward's death, whether as instigator, accomplice or silent consenter, remained a stain on her reputation. To later generations, she embodied both the daring of a woman who defied her husband and the cruelty of one who sanctioned his obliteration. The spectacle of Edward II's downfall reverberated across Europe. Other monarchs watched with unease. Here was proof that a king's authority was not inviolable, that betrayal by nobles and family could destroy even the mightiest. Some rulers took it as a warning, others as inspiration. The deposition demonstrated both the fragility of royal power and the lengths to which subjects would go when disappointed or outraged by their sovereign. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that suspicion about Edward's murder lingered abroad for years. While few courts openly condemned Isabella and Mortimer, many harboured doubts about the official version of events. Edward's tragic fate became a cautionary tale for European princes, reminding them that legitimacy rested not only on divine anointment, but also on political competence and social conformity. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of Edward II's death lies not in what actually happened, but in the stories told about it. Medieval chroniclers used the tale to reinforce moral lessons that weak kings fall, that indulgence leads to ruin, that sins against gender and sexuality invite divine punishment. Later writers adapted the narrative for their own purposes. Reformation authors used it to criticize the corruption of monarchy and the dangers of papal interference. Enlightenment historians debated it as an example of political overreach and tyranny. Modern scholars treat it as a case study in the interaction of propaganda, rumor, and power. The very uncertainty of the event, was it natural death, secret murder, or brutal execution, has allowed it to function as a historical riddle, reshaped to suit the needs of each age. In this sense, the ambiguity itself is the legacy. Edward II's story reminds us that kingship in the Middle Ages was as fragile as it was exalted. The crown could magnify weakness as easily as it could glorify strength. Edward's failures as a military leader and his scandalous relationships eroded the sacred aura that had protected his father. His deposition and death demonstrated that monarchy, though draped in divine symbolism, was ultimately vulnerable to the ruthless logic of politics. Whether he perished naturally, was suffocated by neglect, or endured the fiery torment described in legend, his end marked the ultimate penalty for royal inadequacy. His life became a warning, his death a performance, his legacy a question mark. Standing today in the ruins of Berkeley Castle, one can imagine the whispers of that September night, the clash of chains, the hiss of iron, the muffled cries of a fallen king. History may never yield the truth, but the story remains, a reminder of how power can turn to cruelty, how justice can be twisted into theater, and how the memory of a death can shape politics for generations.